Afternoon, and thank you those of you that are joining the conference virtually online, and thank you to Dr. Dorman for that introduction. This is, as you can maybe hear from my bio, and other than the students that might be on here that might know me, this is a little bit different venue for me to be presenting in, and I'm sort of used to more sort of sport oriented presentation, sport and exercise oriented. So, you know, I'm going to get into this in a minute, but I do want to also thank CROSH for the opportunity, for the invitation to present, and also a special shout out to Toby for all of his technical support and assistance. I don't know if he's on here, but anyway, I'm sure he's lurking somewhere. So thank you as well, everyone, for attending. So, sorry, I'm just trying to advance my slide and it's not. There we go. So I've gotten a lot of questions about this title, my so-called creative title, but you know, I really want to just talk about the tea and yoga side of things and where I was going with that for this presentation. So the quote that you're looking at here, and I'm going to read it in a minute, but it's from a study that I did a few years back now. So in the halcyon days, pre-pandemic, looking at working mothers who were negotiating training and competing their leisure time, competing in sport. So they weren't elite athletes by any means, but they were women who were trying to integrate, you know, their sporting identities into their lives once they became mothers. And, you know, we discussed their barriers, their facilitators, their experiences around negotiating work and leisure. And this particular quote is part of a central theme. You can see the citation there at the bottom of the paper that I published. It's called Juggling Motherhood and Sport, but this theme is juggling motherhood and leisure, in this case, sport and exercise. So I'm going to read the quote if you haven't been reading it already. It says, trying to do work and career can be a good mom and a partner is a juggling act. Juggling those balls is an illusion. It's hard to keep them in the air. Most women get no help or recognition. It's even harder to keep them in the air if more balls keep getting added into the juggling act. Do things just for me? Sure, it's in there. But I just lost my shit when a work email said, try tea and yoga to manage stress. Seriously, let's put another task on the plate. I love tea and yoga, but that isn't going to cut it, not with my workload. So I'm off to a banging start here with this quote, but you know, part of what Joyce, who has 2 young children under the age of 5, is talking about a little bit about, you might have heard of the second shift, which women do in the home after they've done a full day at work. As we know, the home is the workspace, or was the workspace, as well during the pandemic. But the third shift is one that she's talking about here when she refers to teen yoga, which is this idea of managing stress. And we don't often think of self-care as a third shift, but it's sort of disguised as self-care. It's another form of pressure here. So self-care, there's quite a lot of research on this. It's very useful and it's important, but it's also getting offloaded onto women as a solution without social and structural or policy support. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how I'm going to frame this talk as well, as it's not about slamming self-care in and of itself. I'm going to use a critical lens. And, you know, in my work, so Dr. Dorman noted in my introduction that I do use qualitative methods, and I do narrative work. I use stories. I look at stories and I theorize them as, you know, sort of understanding personal, I guess the intertwining of the personal, the social, and the cultural a little bit. But what I'm going to do today is bring this critical lens in to look at social relations, in this case, family and the workplace, and hoping to draw out the idea of work-life balance as, yes, being important, but it really needs a gender equity lens if we're going to, you know, bring forward this as a solution, especially as we're resetting the dial to steal the CROSH whole entire conference title. But my goal is really with this presentation to raise awareness And, some other things as well. I was at Dr. Bélanger's talk this morning, excellent examples and points of how to support employees and oneself. And, Dr. Dorman shortly thereafter and some other presentations noted there's a theme coming through here in this conference, and it's empathy. And yeah, I want to talk about empathy. I'll return to it, but let's think about empathy needing to be also framed with social and structural solutions as well. And as I'm going to look at mothers in the workplace. So, just a few a quick example. I haven't stolen because I've cited it, but I've borrowed this excellent graphic from Canadian Women's Sport, which is an excellent organization that tries to and does very well policies, advocacy for women and girls in sport, and both equality and equity, which the two do go hand in hand. You see the two differences here. And when we're looking at things like diversity, inclusion, again, Dr. Bélanger talking about that this morning, we want to give not just the same tools to everyone and the same resources, which is equality, but look at it through this lens of equity as well. And I'm going to be focusing on gender equity, but I'll touch a little bit on intersectionality and the importance of that as well. So I'm not sure about the the whole makeup of this audience. So I wanted to just bring in a little bit of definitions around work-life balance and really just where some of that's coming from. I've taken this from the Canadian Centre for Occupation or Occupational Health and Safety on work-life balance. And, really two main aspects associated with work-life balance that you see here: lack of time and scheduling conflicts and feeling overwhelmed, overloaded, or stressed by the pressures of multiple roles. Now, work-life balance, if you sort of go and look at some of the origins of work-life balance, not just as a policy or as something that's being advocated, it's sort of a discourse as well. It's got some really ingrained ideas around it, but the history of it used to be work-family balance. And then it got changed a little bit to expand, I guess to be more inclusive and not only look at the family. But if you look at the four categories that are part of it through, also listed through Health Canada, you have role overload. So total demands on time and energy, prescribed, activities or multiple roles that someone might have in the workplace or outside of the workplace. You still see there with those last three, we've got quite a bit of the family coming into play here. So the work to family interference, it might be work demands and responsibilities make it difficult to, fulfill family roles or goals or things that someone wants to do. They can't go to maybe a child's sporting event, for example. And then the family to work interface, which this type of conflict, when family demands and responsibilities make it difficult to fulfill work role once. So a child's illness, for example, prevents attendance at work, or conflicts at home make concentration at work difficult. And then the last one, caregiver strain, multiple dimensions in terms of burdens, caregivers' day-to-day lives. So again, these are things that, people are doing outside of work. But, what I want to draw attention to here is that there is, when you look at these different categories and we're thinking gender equity lens, the categories are not really talked about in terms of gender, although there's certainly some implications there and things are implied. So I'm going to bring that into play in a minute. Why is work-life balance important? Some of these being talked about, I've sat through pretty much all the presentations today. So, but in particular with the keynote this morning, issues around mental health, burnout, absenteeism, presenteeism, lower quality of work, less satisfaction, lost productivity, leaving the workforce, and so on. And these, of course, have been exacerbated by the pandemic, which is not over. We're just in a different wave with it. So there's certainly multiple solutions around some of these different ones, and some do involve policies, but I'll return to that kind of more towards the end of my talk. I want to roll into talking about work-life balance and revisiting work-family interface, family-work interface, and caregiving strains. So caregiving, as a definition, we think of children and other family. There could be other friends, but the majority of people that in Canada anyway that are reporting doing unpaid caregiving are looking at children and then maybe older adults, possibly a partner or a spouse. And these duties often fall on women. So family caregiving is a gender equality, and I would add a gender equity, but have equality issue here in this direct quote from the Canadian Human Rights Commission a few years ago. Women provide more personal care than men, work part-time more often, and give up more hours of work from their full-time jobs to provide care. This negatively affects their full and equal participation in the labor force. Men are also disadvantaged if their caregiving roles are not recognized or supported. So, as a reminder, this is unpaid work. And this is not work that is valued, as evidenced by the current economic crisis in the care economy, both prior to the pandemic and currently. And Dr. Gohar's, insightful presentation looking at nurses, which is, paid caregiving, shows some of these tensions as well. What you're looking at here, just a few recent statistics that I pulled. So the Canadian Social Survey in the 6th cycle, which was looking at mental health and well-being, was just recently released. I think it's either November 11th or November 21st, 2022. And unsurprisingly, supporting that quote around caregiving needing to have a gender equity lens, women in 2022 reported about more than half of women, 52%, providing care to children and care-dependent adults. So this is, again, unpaid caregiving. So these are not people that are working in caregiving jobs. Whether caring for children or adults, women were significantly more likely than men to provide this care. Women and men perform different types of unpaid care duties. Women do more regular activities and emotional labor. And so, when we're looking at caregiving, men are doing more caregiving, but some of the different duties that were looked at in the survey were shown that they might not be the everyday kinds of tasks that are taking the same toll. And when we say emotional labor, different things, negotiating, trying to support someone who might have an illness, or being responsible for the scheduling of birthdays, etc., for children, and then having more emotional labor placed upon them if things are not looking like they're supposed to look. So this is a table taken from Stats Canada, from the same survey, the Canadian Social Survey, from Wellbeing and Caregiving. And I want you to look at this. Look at it closely. We've got proportions of impacts of unpaid care on caregivers of children and adults in the last 12 months, looking at it by gender. So again, here we're looking at, I've posted this one to show the physical and mental health toll of unpaid caregiving. So first off, both men and women are doing this, right? And as noted, a higher proportion of women. Women are experiencing more of the burden of this than men. If you're looking at some of these, so just maybe a few points to point out, over half of unpaid caregivers, over half of all, so both men and women, reported feeling tired of their caregiving responsibilities. 44% felt worried or anxious, but then you do see these proportions being higher. When we start looking at work-life balance, or tying this back to work-life balance, given the emphasis on that related to role conflict, as these relate to family and caregiving, caregiving responsibilities can also affect employment in terms of the caregiver's work-life balance. So 16% of unpaid caregivers, for example, had to adjust their work schedule in order to be more flexible with their responsibilities. 7% had to reduce their regular week work hours, and then 5% were completely unable to work a paid job. So to emphasize, work-life balance is a gender equity issue, especially when we're looking at caregiving encompassing children and other adults. Now, I'm going to circle back to motherhood and my critical lens a little bit here. If I could actually see you all, I would ask for a show of hands of how many of you have heard of these books or read these books, but they're pretty famous in the sociological world of looking at motherhood and occupations, and there is quite a lot of work that's been done since these books. But the Second Shift is probably the most famous one. It came out in the 90s. This is a quote from Arlie Hochschild's work where she interviewed hundreds of working couples, heterosexual couples primarily. And the quote here says, just as there is a wage gap between men and women in the workplace, there's a leisure gap between them at home. Most women work one shift in the office or factory and a second shift at home. So this was, came out in around 1990. The cultural contradictions of motherhood looks at, came out in around 1993, 1994, and talks about, the conflicting demands that women face. So the quote I've pulled here says, working mothers confront not only conflicting demands on their time and energy, but also conflicting ideas. So cultural norms that they're subjected to in the two different spheres about how they're supposed to behave. They should be nurturing and unselfish when engaged in child rearing, but they should also be competitive and ambitious at work. And recent researchers have also shown that, building off of this work, that women who are mothers are often supposed to be nurturing or thought of being more nurturing in the workplace. And if they aren't, they're held to, some different kinds of standards as well. So some different kinds of cultural biases that might impact some of their everyday encounters or some of the emotional labor that they might be encountering. So these two books, written in the 90s, that was a long time ago. Things have advanced, right? So I'm gonna shift next to show you that things have advanced, but they haven't advanced a whole lot. And researchers are showing that actually some of the already issues in gender equity and gender equality in the workplace, and applied to mothers in particular, have actually backward spiraled during the pandemic, or as a result of the pandemic. But these cracks were already there. So as you're hopefully seeing as I'm painting this story for you. So the motherhood penalty, I've got here a book that I've posted, and a quote from the author named Jolie Brierley, who's an author in the United Kingdom, that wrote this book, and also another book called Pregnant and Screwed, basically talking about her experiences of trying to get a job while she was pregnant and being discriminated against pretty heavily. These are real recent books, but this research on the motherhood penalty is not recent by any means. So this has been going on since the early 2000s, and it continues. So the quote I have here is the systematic disadvantage that mothers face in terms of pay, perceived competence, and benefits compared to childless women and men. So let's look at the motherhood penalty in a little bit greater detail. Just have a few points coming up here for you. So the first 3 points that you see, and really, most of the research, or certainly the early research, has looked at the motherhood penalty in terms of wage gaps. Wage gaps and, some of the different issues around that because of wage gaps that women already have. So there's already a pay gap in Canada between what women and men make. And compounding that is, once women become mothers, that gap widens. Oftentimes because of women are taking on longer maternity leaves, or they're going part-time, and so on. So, mothers with one child under 18 earn about 85 cents for every $1 earned by fathers, and about 89 to 90 cents, depending on what you're consulting, earned by women without children. The wage gap persists for 5 years after return to work. So, I debated around how to show this, and I was going to show a real nice graph, but I opted not to. But, part of the story here is younger women are really penalized for this. More than, once women get mid-30s and so on. So if women delay having children, mid-30s and so on, they still take a bit of a hit with their careers and their earnings. But women who have children between 25 and 29 take a greater hit. And this compounds if they have more children, more than one. Now, because we're talking about gender equity and gender equality, I do want to sort of point out around fatherhood that there's a fair bit of research showing that actually the opposite effect happens for men. So there's a fatherhood bonus, and some of this might be related to this legacy of, men primarily being the breadwinners and so on, and women advancing in the workplace, but still with those cultural contradictions I showed you. From the motherhood penalty, from the Hayes's work that I showed you on the other slide. But men's earning have been shown to increase, sometimes as much by 6%, 10%, 15%, and so on. The last 2 points I have are not related to wage side of the motherhood penalty. These are emotional labor issues, and so the mothers being viewed as less competent and serious has really impacted how, once women become mothers and they take a leave, or if they take advantage of some of these workplace policies with like flex time and part-time work, it actually exacerbates how they're perceived. And some of it continues to snowball some of the gaps in their advancement. I'm going to return to this idea of the part-time and the flex time, because we have some opportunities here with the pandemic to change the meaning of that. Less leisure time, so 20% more fragmented leisure. And by that, I mean, oftentimes some research has shown that women they're either not getting their leisure, or they're taking it, they feel guilty, so they come back earlier, or they're actually trying to negotiate caregiving with their leisure. And this is 20% of women compared to 6% of men. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is this shows some of the policies, the uptake of them in Canada, and we see some gender differences here. That, and some of this could really be adding to a different kind of a workplace culture, where if you've got fewer men taking paternity leave, that could even be discouraged. So, looking over here onto this side, 88% of mothers took maternity or paternity leave. 46% of fathers took paternity. 42% just took an annual leave. And then nearly 1 in 2 fathers took 5 weeks or less, 48%. But on to mothers, we have just over 8 and 10 months, 27 to 52 weeks. So much longer, right? Much longer out of the workforce, which might be exacerbating, or I would say not might be, is exacerbating some of these pay inequities and some of these perceptions. Now, I do study media stories, and this was a story that appeared in the fall. It wasn't necessarily pandemic specific, but I wanted to show it to you because there's certainly awareness in workplace cultures around the motherhood penalty. And as I said, there's a lot of research being done on it. But this was just a piece that was done in the Globe and Mail. And looking at the pay gap, hiring bias, competence perception that I talked about already, maternity policies, some of this related to when women leave and they transition back, do they have support, how are they perceived, and then daycare problems. So I have a couple quotes out of here that I pulled for you, speaking of women's stories. So this says, after her second year as an executive at an Ontario nonprofit organization, Sarah, who preferred not to give her last name, fearing recrimination, told her boss that she was 3 months pregnant. He reacted judgmentally, she recalls. He said to her, "You just got married 2 months ago." When she returned from maternity leave, Sarah said her job increased in scope, so she asked for a raise. "It's really cheeky to ask for a raise when you took a year off," her boss said. "My supervisor said, you should just go work somewhere else if you feel that way." Now, this is from someone who is working in a workplace that has maternity leave policies. So I'm putting this up here just maybe to get you to think a little bit about language and what might get said and what might not get said, and that we have policies, which is great, but we need to also look at how those are communicated and taken up. Now I'm shifting for a minute. I had this slide in my talk, and then I took it out, and then I put it back, and then I took it out, and then I put it back this morning. Because I do sport related research, and this is from part of a study that the grant team and myself are looking at. But I won't go into too much detail here, but I really wanted to shift over to the pandemic and looking at the motherhood penalty a little bit and talk about work-life balance. So these are two athletes, two Canadian athletes, Mandy Bujold, who's a flyweight boxer. She's just recently retired, but she was did go to the Tokyo Olympics, and Kim Gaucher, who is a basketball player for Team Canada. And both of these women were essentially being denied their chance to go to the Olympics because of their motherhood status. So there was a lot of talk about this in the news, but both women essentially had to leverage the media because the International Olympic Committee said, forget it, we're not making an exception for you. So Bujold had missed, because of pandemic cancellation, she missed fights that they were going to use to qualify and rank Olympic women, and she had missed those because she had specifically timed her pregnancy so that she wouldn't miss them. So then she missed them. And so she wasn't going to be able to go, even though she had been previously ranked second in the Americas. And Kim Gaucher was a mother of a 4-month-old baby. Multiple women, actually, not just Canadian, were trying to take their babies that were breastfeeding, and they were pretty much told, no way, you're not bringing them. So this created quite a lot of discussions. And, I'm not going to go into sport, but it is, like the rest of society, not always a very gender equitable place. Now, besides the fact that that's the best title ever for a research paper, talking about some other impacts on women's careers. So I'm showing you sports women, and these are sports women that are at the top of their game, and they're being discriminated against. this is the toll. This piece was from some women scientists who, were responding to this journal about the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on their careers. And so this was an academic workspace, so to speak. And, I pulled this quote out, which says the COVID-19 pandemic has tended to aggravate existing social inequalities. A survey among principal investigators in science by Myers et al. Showed the unequal effects the pandemic has had on scientists, with female scientists with young children being disproportionately affected. By diminishing scientific productivity, the pandemic might have long-lasting effects on careers. So we're seeing that in academia with, women scientists who are mothers not being able to produce their papers, their work, their research at the same rate. Now, I'm going to go a little bit, in terms of more, I guess we say more general population, and, just look at some recent survey work and how the pandemic, which some people are calling it a fourth shift for mothers, as they, had to tend to being teachers and leaders in their home space, as well as working in their home space. So this was a survey that was done. It wasn't only looking at women, it was looking at women and men, and 1,500 caregivers, April 2022. And they looked at quite a bit at mental health. That's why I have the catchy title there, COVID-19 pandemic and the mother load. But nearly half of Canadian moms, are saying that they've reached their breaking point, versus 39% of dads. But I want to draw your attention again to say that men are also reaching the breaking point. These are just a few of the other points related to mental health. And I put this up because as we're thinking about resetting the dial, or we're looking at workspaces, we're thinking about empathy as a theme. Look at some of these points. I'm not going to read them all, right? But we've got 3 in 5 are concerned about their emotional well-being. 3 in 5 mothers. More than 1/3 of moms say they're struggling to keep up with work demands, up from 28% in 2021. 2 in 5 have put their career on the back burner to manage home and caregiving responsibilities. So we've got some of this legacy. The vast majority of moms agree that mothers and caregivers have been significantly impacted by the pandemic and need more support. I pulled this quote out from, because they had open-ended responses in their survey, and this is reflecting, I think, the second shift, but maybe the fourth shift that women under the pandemic were under, as well as the second shift. I'm caring for my children and parents while trying to keep myself healthy and well, says one mother. I also have responsibilities to my employer. It's been trial by fire. I've had many breakdowns and cried more in this year than ever. One thing I haven't said, and I probably should have said it sooner, but the intersectionality comes into play here for racialized women, women with disabilities, women that are caring for children with disabilities, and so on, single parents, and women that might be already working in part-time jobs. My sister and I are very close, and so I'll tell you a quick little story. We text every single day, and my sister is a caregiver to my niece and nephew, who are young adults, but they're young autistic adults, so they cannot and do not live independently. And I said to my sister, can I share some of your story? And this is her text. Feel free to. I think I'm a fine example of a caregiver who's constantly trying to avoid falling into the abyss. I'm at the mercy of these support workers showing up. Sometimes they don't. And then I can't do anything at all in my life. I feel like some days I have no freedom and no spontaneity. So what's the story? I feel like I've painted a very, very bleak picture, but I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to just, come back full circle with the critical lens to remind us empathy, psychological safety, emotional well-being are more important than ever. When we look at, there's a few things I want to bring out. Work-life balance is important. It is linked to mental health. It is linked to productivity. It is linked to, all of these different points that I showed you earlier. But it's more than offering self-care. People need self-care now more than ever. But, when we bring in a gender equity lens and even an intersectionality lens, we see that this is not always equitable. That there's a lot of nuances going on here, and this has been not just impacted by the pandemic, but exacerbated by the pandemic. So I'm bringing it on home for my final takeaway. So we were told to give a takeaway, and I'm sitting here this morning listening to all these brilliant solutions, and I thought, you know what, I really am not offering people any solutions. I'm just pointing out how bad everything is. But I want to leave you with a key message that might lead to some solutions. Resetting the dial on workplace climate it's an opportunity to question and reset what is normal. So this phrase of returning to normal is one that people, I think, have craved in some sense, but a gender equity lens shows us, indeed, it tells us that what was normal for many pre-pandemic, such as mothers in the workplace and caregivers, disadvantaged and disadvantages them, and it compromises their mental health, well-being, and economic growth. This has become even more pronounced when we bring an intersectional lens to gender equity, racialized mothers, women working part-time in certain sectors, lower income wages. Critical awareness of the motherhood penalty is really, really important and useful as we look at work-life balance moving forward with a gender equity lens. We have an opportunity to rethink workplace policies, value caregiving. This is work. This is work. This is unpaid work. So what people are doing outside of work is really creating some tensions in their lives and compromising mental health. Parent-friendly workplace cultures. We've got a number of things going on right now in Canada. Things around flexible work arrangements, for example, legislation with that, the $10 a day daycare. But just looking into all of that, there's issues with that. The demand is so high. I was reading a story the other day that was saying they're already short 220,000 spots. Families, about 230,000 children are going to be left unable to access that. So, what can workplaces do? What can managers say that models for men as well? Maybe millennial men that I'm seeing in some studies that want to come up to the same level or a similar level as women, but are not encouraged to take that same paternity leave. My final message is this: support mothers. Hire women, pay women, promote women, because women are badasses. That's my TED Talk. I'm done. Thank you, and open for any questions.
Oh my God, Kerry. I laughed. I cried.
I laughed. I cried.
I felt heard.
Screen.
Yeah, that was wonderful. That was wonderful. I think you had some amazing take-home to-do messages. Okay, but we have questions, and I want to give you opportunity because we only have 5 minutes for questions. So first one's from Sean Stadden. Has there been any studies related to caregivers of special needs children, for example, autism, Down syndrome, and their career outcomes? Do social supports provided lack of effect? Do social supports provided affect the ability of a caregiver to have career success? So I think that's 2 parts. I think the first part is,
more a statement than a question.
Well, I think it's a question. He's saying, is there evidence that caregivers of special needs also have effects on their career outcome?
Yeah. I mean, so this is not my research area. And my sister's going to laugh when I tell her that that was the first question I got, and not laugh in a bad way, but this is all she does. And I jokingly said to her, I said, this whole talk could be on disability and parents who have children with disabilities. Yes, there is absolutely research on this. It is not my area of research, but I'll tell you from, I guess, my own personal experience, as having a sister that I'm very close with. She's in Alberta, actually, so it's not a utopian society over there. They have the mountains, but that's about it. But the caregiver part of what I was alluding to as well, and I know Dr. Gohar was talking a little bit about the crisis in nursing. There's a caregiver crisis. And people that have children with disabilities need those caregivers. And depending on the province that you're living in, you don't have funding for those caregivers. My own sister's career was a full-time music teacher, a very, very talented music teacher. And she had to give all that up when both children were diagnosed with autism. And she's a small business owner, and she's had impacts of that with the pandemic as well, but it's impacted her career choice. So she exited the full-time workforce, but she still works full-time. She's a small business owner, but part of the reason why she did that and does that is because of having 2 children with a disability. I mean, I will also say that the divorce rate is quite high in couples that have children with disabilities, and so you get sometimes single parenting as well with that. So with having to have care workers come in, that's been a problem with the pandemic, because it was already a problem, but that work as well, which I didn't get into, is also undervalued and underpaid and underfunded. And so there absolutely is research on this. And when I was reading the research on just the caregiver economy, what I did read, it was pretty clear, and the government of Canada has said this, but time will tell, right? Like they said, part of the economic recovery needs to be that we need to have a caregiver recovery economy. I mean, that's just not happening, right? Like people are leaving these professions because they're underpaid and they're underfunded. But one of the points I was trying to make, I don't know if I made it clearly, is it's mostly women in these professions. So that's why they're under, I mean, that's not the only reason, but historically, that's why they're underpaid and undervalued. This is also creating an extra burden. This isn't just parents with children with disabilities. Social services and all kinds of services have been removed, and they're placed in the hands of families. Right. And so this is upping what parents, if you have 2 parents in a home, whatever the gender, whether you have mothers and fathers, 2 fathers, 2 mothers, parents are being taxed on top of that. And then on top of that, you have caring for parents of parents.